Hey everyone, it's Olivia and welcome back to this week's episode of Rhetoric Nerds. Grab a cup of coffee because this week's a good one. Former President Richard Nixon faced a large accusation when running for vice president alongside Dwight D. Eisenhower. We would expect him to overtly admit fault or deny the accusation, but he doesn't. Normally apologia, a speech in defense of oneself, without this transparency, it fails. But in this case, it didn't, and was actually hugely successful. In this video, I'll explore why Nixon was so successful and provide tips for effective persuasion and unifying your audience. So let me set the scene before I dive into Nixon's speech itself. It's September of 1952, and Nixon is accused of secretly receiving $18,000 from California business people, a slush fund in exchange for granting political favors. This is known as quid pro quo, where a politician accepts donations in exchange for political favors. There are a lot of ethical concerns at play because this is a serious breach of propriety. The slush fund scandal became a journalistic sensation. The Republican Party and Eisenhower were under a lot of pressure to remove Nixon from the ticket. Nixon's closest advisors even advised him to remove himself from the ticket. In response to this scandal, Republican leaders bought television airtime. Nixon would have the chance to defend himself in front of the American public in a face-to-face manner. In a Los Angeles theater, Nixon gave his apologia, titled Checkers. Over 60 million Americans tuned in via radio or television to listen to this address. And it was checkers that changed the course of American history. Not only was Nixon able to win back his credibility as both a man and politician, but he gained even greater likability than before the scandal. Over 2 million telegrams and letters were sent to the National Republican headquarters expressing favoritism towards Nixon and that he should remain on the ballot. So Nixon stayed on the ballot, gained an even stronger public image, and then went on to win the 1953 election. Not only did Eisenhower and Nixon win, but they swept the election. The Republican Party had over 400 electoral college votes compared to just 89 for the Democratic Party. Checkers is largely attributed to this success, so let's get into it. First, Nixon strategically admits wrongdoing. How so? Well, he refused to state if he was explicitly guilty or not. We would expect his credibility to shatter by not owning up to the accusation or clearly admitting guilt. This is typically how individuals respond to apologia. If you look closely at Nixon's apologia, he leaves listeners more confused than before. Instead of explicitly stating if he took the money or not, he distracted the audience with just irrelevant evidence. We might see this as a type of red herring. He does this in the opening few minutes of the speech. He states the accusation.
I'm sure that you have read the charge and you've heard it, that I, Senator Nixon, took $18,000 from a group of my supporters. Now, was that wrong? And let me say that it was wrong. I'm saying, incidentally, that it was wrong, not just illegal.
This statement warrants an explicit response. We'd expect him to state, yes, I am guilty of quid pro quo, or no, I am not. He also uses a type of red herring when questioning the morality of quid pro quo.
Because it isn't a question of whether it was legal or illegal. That isn't enough. The question is, was it morally wrong? I say that it was morally wrong if any of that $18,000 went to Senator Nixon for my personal use. I say that it was morally wrong if it was secretly given and secretly handled. And I say that it was morally wrong if any of the contributors got special favors for the contributions that they made.
The use of red herring intentionally distracts the listener. They are distracted from the purpose of the speech, for Nixon himself to deny or plead guilty, but now they're focused on the morality of quid pro quo. When he establishes this common ground around morality of quid pro quo, he's taken the audience down a separate path. He doesn't have to come forward and admit fault. That's why he's able to get away with not overtly admitting fault. His use of distracting stories works because he's directed the audience's attention away from the accusation, but now into a conversation of morality. Through these distractions, he strategically gets the audience to agree on the morals behind quid pro quo. So then they go on to agree with him in the end and be on his side. So Nixon strategically admits wrongdoing through these red herring-like appeals. And the audience seems to go along with these appeals. They come absorbed with his large appeal to sympathy. Nixon's appeals to sympathy don't support the exigence at hand. Through his stories and anecdotes, although they were a red herring, they were able to humanize Nixon. And implicitly asking for sympathy was a first for him. He was known as a cold and vengeful man. Appealing to sympathy is an important step in building credibility. But Nixon appealed to sympathy in a situation that doesn't warrant sympathy, but instead warrants honesty. He builds an image of a modest American man. For instance, he discusses how taxpayers should not pay for political speeches and discusses ways to fund these speeches in an ethical way.
The first way is to be a rich man. I don't happen to be a rich man, so I couldn't use that way.
He then goes on to detail his complete financial history for the American public. He starts with this.
Our family was one of modest circumstances. The only reason we were able to make it go was because my mother and dad had 5 boys, and we all worked in the store.
Let's take a look at the language he uses here. Modest circumstances, make it go, and worked in the store. All work to make him relatable to the audience, and that he was once in their shoes trying to make ends meet. A top appeal to sympathy is in the title of the speech, Checkers. Nixon tells a story of how his 2 daughters received the family dog, Checkers, a Cocker Spaniel, as a gift after his senatorial election.
And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers.
The audience can see the family all together with their loving dog, thus pulling on their heartstrings. This frames Nixon as a good man and a strong family man. But when we take a step back, we realize that an anecdote about the family dog really serves no place in an accusation of quid pro quo. These examples frame Nixon as a modest man. He's purposely choosing to lean into the audience's emotion and sympathy. But when we take a step back, we realize that these stories and anecdotes are irrelevant to his accusation at hand. Just because he's not a rich man, grew up in a modest household, and was gifted a dog does not mean he's innocent of quid pro quo, which was the exigence at hand. These stories allow him to get away with being ambiguous regarding the situation and actually works to build strong rapport with Americans, making him seem more credible and more likable. Nixon diverted the audience's attention to focus on his credibility as a man, father, American, and leader of the people. By doing so, he failed to establish his credibility as a politician, trusted government official, and fair player. This move implicitly built a hierarchy of credibility. For any position, being loyal to one's family and meeting the needs of the people serve as a root of credibility. If you have that foundation, like Nixon claims he does, then you are credible in all levels of the pyramid. So he created this reasoning for why he could beat around the bush in regards to his political credibility, because he had this foundational credibility as a man. Taking a critical look, you realize that both the stories and the sympathy they try to draw don't serve as adequate evidence for the unethical financial accusation Nixon is facing. As I've noted throughout the video, this speech had its problems. However, there are 2 key tips I recommend speakers adapt into their own work. Both of these tips work to advance one of Nixon's primary goals with this speech, to persuade Americans to keep him on the Republican ticket. We know persuasion is something that we engage in every day, even if we're not politicians. So first, use Topoi. Topoi, in essence, is a central theme or value that connects you and your audience. In this case, Nixon used American Topoi. Although his stories were clearly irrelevant to the issue at hand, they were clearly received well by the American public. It's important for speakers to critically think about their audience and develop appeals that would be received well by that specific audience. It is important to realize what your audience values and really lean into those values, because that will help you be more persuasive. In this case, Nixon leaned heavily on the value of modesty. This is an American topoi because modesty is a key foundational value of America. That anyone, regardless of how much money you have, can work hard and climb the economic ladder. This appeals to all Americans because everyone wants to make their lives better and make their families' lives better. Nixon shows that he is leading by example, which helps advance one of his primary goals, to keep him on the ticket and to persuade Americans to keep him on that ticket. Second, use physical movements to emphasize important points. Nixon was seated throughout the speech, as you saw in those clips. This represented a typical television broadcast. But about 3/4 of the way into the speech, he stands up. This creates a larger frame for the camera to capture and is a bit jarring for the audience. But this movement serves a greater purpose. He moves on a very critical line during a very crucial part of the speech that's going to win over voters and persuade them to keep him on the ticket. He moves on, "Why do I feel so deeply?" This direct appeal to pathos is amplified with this movement. So your words have power, but your movement does as well. And both can work in tandem to amplify certain ideas and really persuade your audience. To wrap up, although there were some problems with Nixon's checkers speech, the speech was remarkably effective. Americans demonstrated a strong favoritism towards Nixon without him overtly stating if he was guilty or not, and his appeals to sympathy won over his American audience. George D. Giopin, a professor of rhetoric at Duke University, says this was Nixon's, quote, single most effective speech, end quote, making it so important to study today. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Rhetoric Nerds, and I'll see you in our next one. Bye!